This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. This episode of SE Radio is brought to you by Braintree. If you think that your payment system exists solely for the purpose of transferring money from your customer's wallet to yours, think again. Braintree. Rethink payments. Learn more at braintreepayments.com/SE Radio.
Hello, this is Matthew Farwell for Software Engineering Radio. Today's episode is about Angular with Yakov Fain. Yakov is the co-author of the Amazon bestseller Angular 2 Development with Typescript, as well as a number of other technical books on programming. Yakov works as a software architect at the IT consultancy Farwell Systems. A Java champion, he has taught multiple classes and workshops on web and Java-related technologies, presented at international conferences, and published more than 1,000 blog posts. Welcome to Software Engineering Radio, Yakov.
Hi, Matt. Hello, everybody.
Today we're going to talk about Angular, which is a JavaScript-based web development framework. We've had on Software Engineering Radio some shows before on JavaScript, notably 248, Axel Rauschmeier on JavaScript and ECMAScript 6, and show 230 with Shubrakar on Node.js, but this time we're concentrating on front-end development. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Yakov, what is Angular?
If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, I'd say this is a framework for web development. But now I'd rather say this is a platform for development of the front end of the web applications, as well as mobile applications, as well as desktop applications. So this is a product developed by Google, and it was announced as a new version of super popular AngularJS framework, which is version 1. Mm-hmm. But actually it's a complete rewrite. It's a different framework, and in my opinion it's much more powerful than what it used to be.
Okay, so is Angular a framework or a library?
It's definitely a framework. Definitely.
What's the difference?
The difference is that if you take a library, you can combine it with other libraries. You can decide on the architecture of the application. You can write everything, say, in pure JavaScript plus the library XYZ. The library doesn't prescribe you to how to structure your applications, whereas framework does. So frameworks tell you how to do things, and you insert your code in playing by certain rules. So in that regard, Angular is definitely a framework.
Okay, I've heard it said that it's the Hollywood principle. Don't call us, we'll call you. Would you agree with that?
The Hollywood principle is often mentioned in regards to particular aspect of the framework, and this would be dependency injection. Angular has this module, right? So don't call me, I'll call you means, in my understanding, that I'm not going to be creating instances of the object whenever I want to. The container, in this case, Angular being the container, would do it for me and insert it into where I want.
Okay.
So in that regard, it is. But Angular is much more than just dependency injection. It has a bunch of modules. It has dependency injection. It has the router, super powerful router. It comes with the library called RxJS for reactive programming. It comes with excellent tooling. The recommended language for Angular is Typescript, which is a product of Microsoft. Also, there is a module for server-side rendering. They integrated with bundling tooling. So it comes with a tool that allows you to create bundles that will be deployed on the web servers. So in that regard, we can say that Angular framework comes with the batteries included.
Okay. So why do we need a framework for JavaScript development?
Why? It's not a difficult question to answer. Because not everybody is super smart. Not every developer who works on web applications is super smart, who can pick and choose like a la carte kind of things. Which library I need, or do I need them? Maybe I just will write everything in JavaScript. we work in many cases in teams, and the skill level in any team, especially in the enterprise world, could be different. There could be some experienced developers, some junior developers, and so on. So having a framework greatly simplifies the understanding of a particular application. Say I am a JavaScript developer who also knows Angular and, to that matter, any framework, and I join a team. If you hired me knowing that I know this framework, you know that I will have easier times in getting on board, in understanding how the application works, because it plays by certain rules and it belongs to certain structure. So in that regard, having a framework is beneficial for real-world enterprise development. If you are a one-man shop, and if you are a very experienced developer, maybe you don't need a framework.
Would you describe Angular as an opinionated framework?
Definitely.
Actually, what is an opinionated framework?
Well, the framework that has an opinion how you're supposed to do things. And in many cases, Angular places certain restrictions as to how to do things. For example, you want to implement an Angular application, which in most cases are so-called single-page applications, where the browser doesn't refresh the entire page, but only changes certain fragments on the page as the user navigates, clicks on the links or buttons or so on. There is a module called Router. Router tells you how you are supposed to navigate from point A to point B. And in that regard, there is certain APIs that you have to stick to, and it's not like you are free to do whatever you want.
Okay. What are the goals of Angular then? What does it aim to help you with?
Well, apparently, Angular team will give you maybe more official or proper answer. In my opinion, the goal of Angular is to bring the common ground to a team that works on a web application. The other goal would be to give them tools that will allow them, developers, to easily solve typical issues that any application needs to solve. For example, how do I navigate the page, as I said? How do I build a project? How do I make sure that the user cannot click on a link until certain data is available? How do I modularize the application? So my application is not a monolith, but it's cut into pieces. So smaller pieces are loaded and some pieces are loaded on demand. So all that is given to you by Angular framework.
So talking of components, what are the constituent parts of an Angular application?
That's a good question, because Angular comparing to AngularJS is a complete switch in the architecture from being an MVC framework, model view controller, to being component-based framework. So the application is a bunch of components, starting from the top-level component, root component, which may have child component, children may have their own children, and so on. So the application is a bunch of Legos, so to speak, components that can talk to each other, communicate with each other. A component A can pass the data to component B. A component B can send out events about something that happens inside. Components can be brought together in a loosely coupled fashion, which is super important. So yes, it's a component-based framework. And a component is a piece of code with certain functionality. Typically, a component consists of the code. The recommended language is Typescript, even though you can write Angular application in Typescript in a couple of flavors of JavaScript, such as ECMAScript 5, ECMAScript 6, 7. Or you can use a language called Dart, created by Google. So the component consists of a file which has, say, class in TypeScript or script in TypeScript. The other file could contain HTML, or you may decide to keep HTML inline. The third file could contain CSS, cascading style sheets. What else is recommended to create testing? So you can create another file with extension spec.ts, which would be, say, unit test, or maybe end-to-end test. But basically, this group of files represents a component. Typically, these files are located in one directory. So your project will consist of multiple directories, subdirectories. Each directory will have a component.
Is that a visual component, or is that a...
Yes. Component is always something visual. It's something that has a UI. Think of it this way. You write a class in Typescript, and if you will add a decorator or annotation, for example, in Java we call these things annotations, add component, prepend it to the class definition, and in there you define the template, you define CSS. This is what makes a class a component. Without that add component annotation, without the UI, it's not a component. If you want to implement a piece of logic, then you just create a class and put any logics you want in there, but this is not a component. So a component is always something with UI.
So does Angular help you with the other bits, the bits that aren't the visual stuff? For instance, you said that we have a class that we have to, if you have a service, if you have a common code between all of the components.
Angular helps you in a way that it comes with an excellent tool, which is code generator called Angular CLI, command line interface, that allows you to quickly generate either a component or a directive or a class or a service. By the way, we never gave a definition for the service. What is a service? A service is also a class, but it contains only some business logic. For example, communication with the backend or some calculations. And services are injected into components. So if you write a component, then a component has a constructor. And in the constructor, if you define an argument of type of certain service, for example, product service, or customer service, which would bring you some data about product or customers. In the component constructor, you just define an argument of product service, and Angular is smart enough to understand, he wants product service. Let me create an instance and inject it into this component.
When you say component, is that the same thing as a web component?
It's not the same thing as a web component. Web component is a standard, basically, that consists of several things. But you can think of it that Angular components are very similar to what is planned for web components. It is a piece of functionality with a UI, let me put it this way. Well encapsulated with well-defined input and output. And if you create a component in Angular, you define in there so-called selector. Say selector is product. It's class and annotation. Inside the annotation, you define a selector product. After that, you can include this new tag in HTML. New tag being open angle bracket, product, close angle bracket. And this becomes, in this sense, it becomes a web component. So when you look at the HTML of your application, you see all these angle brackets, which some of them are HTML elements, while some of them represent Angular components.
So how do I put an Angular application together? How do I build it up? You mentioned dependency injection before?
I did, yes. But the start became pretty painless, so to speak. A year ago, many people complained that Angular 2 is not easy to get into because it comes with a whole bunch of configuration files and toolings, and you write in Typescript but deploy in JavaScript, and you need some kind of a tool to build the app. So Angular team created an excellent tool called Angular CLI, which is a code generator. I already mentioned this. It can get you started real quickly. You install it on your computer, and after that you get a command ng, and then you say ng new and name of the project on the command line, I mean, and it takes like 30 seconds, and you get a new project, directory, subdirectories, and everything. It's a minimalistic application, kind of hello world thing, and you open it up. Either you open it up in your IDE, or you can just run another command from the command line. And for example, ng serve. This command instructs Angular CLI, build this app, create bundles out of it, and deploy it. And you can open it up in the browser, and it runs. So in that regard, it's pretty easy to start. If you want to open it in your IDE to see the structure and work like we always do, you can pick up one of excellent IDEs that are available. For example, I'm using WebStorm from JetBrains. And the other excellent IDE is Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code, not to be confused with Visual Studio 2015. Visual Studio Code is a free open source IDE. Then, if you want, you can install plugin for TypeScript and Angular for Sublime Text, for example. Support is just amazing. I mean, people who just write JavaScript, they can only dream of such support as we have in Angular and TypeScript. So you open up your IDE and you see a clean structure. Folder, subfolder, SRC folder, AAPP folder. As you keep adding new components, you get new folders, some number of configuration files, and well-defined commands how to build a component. An application.
What is data binding?
Data binding is about keeping things synchronized. Say you have a field on the UI, and you have a class variable in the TypeScript code. And you want to make sure that if somebody is entering something in the UI control on the web page, this value will jump right in that variable in TypeScript. Or if somebody modified the value of that variable, say you make a server request and the value changed, you want to immediately show it on the UI. So you can do this using binding. So you bind a variable in a class to a control on the UI. Or you can bind, say, a button on the UI to a function that will handle that button click event. And this is what the binding is.
Is that a two-way thing, or is that just simply one way from the model to the page?
Angular supports both way, but default way is one way, or they say unidirectional communication. This is a big difference comparing to AngularJS, where two-way binding was the way to go, which caused some performance issues. So in Angular, they decided to do things in unidirectional way. So they are basically saying, if you need to update something on the UI, just update a variable in your TypeScript class, and since the variable is bound to the UI will be updated automatically. But if you want to still use two-way binding, in some cases it may be beneficial. For example, you have a simple form, and you want to bind every field on the form to certain variables or to a model. You can use something called ng model, which is ng model with certain syntax which allow you to do binding in two ways. But Angular CLI, I never mentioned, it comes with pretty convenient and powerful forms API. So to be honest with you, I can live pretty happily with one-way binding.
So is that how you would handle things like validation for forms using
validation of the validation of the forms is handled using validation API, basically. Angular Forms API comes with two APIs how to create a form itself. One of them is so-called template-driven, and the other one is so-called reactive API. Template-driven is when you define the whole form inside the template, meaning like HTML-like piece inside the annotation template. Whereas reactive API is when you write actually code. If you want to create a model that supports the form, you would create a new instance of the object model and you would add some field in there, but it would be in the code. So two API for the form itself, and the validation accordingly. You can do validation using template API or using reactive API. So you can write a function, for example. Say you want to validate the value of the email. Angular 4 comes with a pre-packaged validator for email. Or you want to do required, or you want to do min-max length. These things are they came out of the box. But also you can create a custom validation. For example, here in the United States we have social security number, unique ID for every person in the country. It must have 9 digits, right? So you can write a simple functions. In there, you can put a regular expression that would make sure that it has 9 digits. And as you build a form, you can also attach 1 or more, actually 0 or more validators to every form control. And the thing will work automatically. Also, Forms API supports asynchronous validation. So you can do validation of the server, for example. It also works pretty well.
Does that work? Does it do an HTTP call to the server to validate?
Let me put it more generically. It makes a call to a service that you will write.
Okay.
Again, as a reminder, service is just a class. So you can say, here's a class which has a whole bunch of different validation methods. And inside these methods, you can, if you want, make HTTP calls. And asynchronously, as the data come back, validating on the server side, you will get either okay, like the value is valid, or not okay. And you subscribe for the changes. Actually, we never touched the subject of reactive programming, of RxJS, but even in forms, you can subscribe to changes like form was not valid, now it is valid, or the validation request comes back. So it's super powerful.
Okay, on Software Engineering Radio, we've had 2 or 3 shows on reactive programming, notably 267 Jürgen Höller on Reactive Spring and 249 Vaughan Vernon on reactive programming with actors. But could you describe how reactive programming fits in with Angular?
Definitely. I personally do reactive programming in 2 languages. I'm using RxJava 2 for Java, and I'm using RxJS 5, which is bundled with Angular. Reactive programming in Angular is used with the support of the library that is called RxJS. RxJS 5 specifically is packaged with Angular, and it's built on the same principles as any reactive extension library is. Observable is something that pushes data. Observer is a class, as an object or a function that knows what to do with the data when it arrives. A bunch of operators that can handle the data en route, so to speak. So as the data comes from observable to the subscriber, to this stream, you can chain a bunch of operators in there and process the data. For example, filter, map, and many other things, like about maybe 100 of operators or so. So in Angular, in multiple occasions, they already use and they give you these access to these observable streams. For example, when you move using router from point A to point B, in many cases, you need to pass the data as you are moving along. For example, you're looking at the screen with product ID. There is a list of products, and you want to go to another area, to another component that shows product detail. Product detail for which product? You need to pass an ID, right? So in the router, you can subscribe to changing IDs that are given from component A to component B using the router.
Are we talking about the 2 bits of a page, or the 2 sides of a page? Or?
Yes. 2 components which can be sitting on the same page, like master detail kind of thing, implementation. Why master component shows a list of products. You click on it. Initially, it goes and shows on the right the detail about this component, but that's a separate component in of itself, the detail component. As a stream of the as you select different products, the stream gives you different IDs. As I mentioned already, in the forms, you also use subscription to observables. HTTP request is done using the same paradigm. When you make an HTTP request, you're getting back not a promise as it used to be in AngularJS, but you subscribe to an observable. Even though the HTTP request is typically one thing, one item, you still subscribe. You may use WebSocket and subscribe to incoming data this way as well. So in many places it is being used. Plus, you can write your own services that are wrappers for RxJS library, and you can implement any Rx flows as you want.
So an HTTP request, just to clarify, an HTTP request is done via Rx as an observable, and then eventually you will get a response back.
Right, HTTP is an asynchronous operation. So there is an HTTP object inside that comes with Angular. And obviously they define these standard methods in there: get, put, post, delete, and so on. Each of these methods returns an observable. When you see that in the doc, it means that you can subscribe to it.
Okay.
And moreover, it gives you a power that you may not find in other places. For example, let's say you make an HTTP request, and you are holding a mobile phone in a slow connection area. What happens is the user becomes annoyed because the request is not coming back for 5 seconds, so he enters something else and he makes another request. For example, I wanted to check the price on the IBM in stock market. Now it didn't come back. Let me check the Apple's price. So what happens with the first request? It never comes back. It will come back eventually, and it will clog your poor bandwidth whenever it comes back. Using operators, in particular, I'm referring to a switch map operator in Rx, you can easily kill the unfinished request in one line. So it's excellent.
So it cancels the request?
It kills it, right?
So this brings us on to an interesting question. Am I forced to use RxJS, or can I replace it with another? You're saying that Angular gives me a framework and makes a lot of decisions for me. Could I replace RxJS with another library such as Bacon?
No, you can't do this. Basically, RxJS is a dependency of Angular. I mean, obviously, you can do anything you want if your goal is to kill this framework and do something else. But it would be a very difficult job, and I don't see a reason to do this. For example, you have an HTTP object that comes with Angular. Underneath, it assumes that you will be subscribing to it using RxJS. Can you make a surgery somehow? Maybe. If you are a hacker, you may, but why? Explain why. I don't see a reason why doing this.
One of the questions that came to mind is if you didn't want to use a library which was specifically written for Angular, for instance, jQuery UI, or if you wanted to use XML rather than JSON, an XML library rather than JSON library, are there points at which you can plug in new functionality?
Yes, but it's different. What you asked before is, can you rip RxJS from Angular and put something else inside? That's one thing. But if you are asking, can I use third-party JavaScript library, which are tons of, with Angular, the answer is yes. You can add, even though it's not needed, but say you're a fan of jQuery UI. And even though Angular has its own library called Angular Material 2, you may say, I don't want to use it. I want to use jQuery UI. I am pretty comfortable, or I know a particular component that I love. Yes, you can do this. You can add jQuery UI as a dependency. When you will install all dependencies in your project, jQuery UI will be installed inside the Node modules library where everything else is. And there are a couple of cases how do you work with external libraries. One of them, you can find a so-called Typescript definition file. If you want to have full IDE support for something written in JavaScript with types, or you can just declare this variable. For example, if you want to add jQuery, you know that jQuery creates a global object inside the browser, right? jQuery, or that dollar. You can declare this variable and say, I'm going to get it there. When the application will run, there will be something known as a dollar. And you can use the API. If you'll do it a simple way, like I just said, by declaring a variable, you will not get support of IDEs. On the other hand, since TypeScript is a type language, good people out there from the community created type definitions for jQuery, for example, and you can download it, and then you will get full support for the API as you use jQuery inside Angular. Again, it's not recommended using jQuery, but there are other libraries, for example, D3. People use it for charting, and they want to use it with Angular. Same procedure.
Users want a simple way to pay. You want an easy integration. Braintree allows you to accept nearly any payment type from almost any device with just one integration. It's flexible to your system's needs and supports most programming languages. And when your checkout is simpler and faster, you're going to have happier customers. That's what we call a win-win. Learn more at braintreepayments.com/SERadio.
So what doesn't Angular do? It has this defined way that it wants you to work. What doesn't it cover? What are the pain points with Angular?
I don't know of any specific pain points, but there are some areas that Angular delegates things to. One of the smart decisions when they designed Angular was to make a renderer a separate piece, the piece that renders the UI. That opened up the opportunity for third-party companies to replace HTML as a renderer, as a language for rendering, with something else. For example, there is a library called Nativescript. Nativescript is a library for mobile development, and they give you their own set of tags that you can use in Angular templates. And these tags are internally in that library, are mapped to native components on iOS or Android. So if you decide to use Angular for mobile development, I'm talking about not a hybrid development where the mobile phone will run some web view or web browser internally and then your app. I'm talking about native rendering of native components of iOS and Android. You can use that Nativescript library and their tags instead of using divs or whatever input fields in HTML. You will be using their tags, and they will compile it into native libraries. So I would say this is a delegation of something that is not implemented in Angular to somewhere else. Or there is UI library. You can use standard UI. You can use UI with Bootstrap if you want from Twitter. Or Angular team currently is developing a UI library called Angular Material 2. For now, as of today, it has like 25 UI controls. Very well done, high quality controls. But 25 controls is not enough for a real application. So there are third-party libraries. For example, we use, in our company, we use PrimeNG. PrimeNG is an open source library which has 70 plus UI controls. So we use a mix of Angular Material 2 controls and PrimeNG. So there are areas that could be complemented, but it's not developed by Angular team, so to speak.
Is Angular open source?
Angular is open source. It's MIT licensed, yes.
And where did it come from? Who develops Angular?
Google has a team, specifically designated Angular team, who works already for 2 years on this framework. And they have, within that team, they have dedicated groups. For example, one of them is working on Angular Material 2. The other group is working on Angular CLI and so on. But it's a Google-driven framework.
Okay. And
they have excellent collaboration with Microsoft. 2 years ago, when they started developing Angular 2, what was used to call Angular 2, now it's already Angular 4, they planned to create a special language for it, for the framework, called Typescript. And then they looked at Typescript and they contacted Microsoft asking, guys, if you will add certain things to your language, we'll be happily using Typescript. Microsoft agreed, and there is an excellent collaboration in that regard between Google and Microsoft. Typescript is booming now. I think that Angular contributes a lot to the popularity of Typescript. I believe if you will check latest Stack Overflow developer surveys and so, TypeScript is one of the most, it jumped right into like 10 most popular language and loved language and so on. So TypeScript benefits and Angular benefits. TypeScript is an excellent language, and it was created by the same creator who created C#, right? So probably they know how to create languages. So I really like it.
Just briefly, could you explain what TypeScript is?
TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. By saying superset in a simplistic way, I can explain that if you have a file written in JavaScript, main.js, with some script, If you will just rename it to main.ts, TS is extension for TypeScript, then it's a valid TypeScript code already. You didn't change a thing yet. But TypeScript introduces types. So you can declare variables with types. First of all, TypeScript is based on the JavaScript standards. It's built on them, and it adds certain new things. So you can declare types, but they don't force you to declare types. You can keep just using variables without declaring them, and TypeScript is smart enough to figure out what is the type that you want. On the other hand, you can upfront declare types, and then you'll get the whole power of tooling and IDE support and everything. Also, they add things that JavaScript doesn't have. Me being a Java developer, for me it's very easy to learn. For example, they have interfaces in TypeScript, which don't exist in JavaScript. Interfaces are very similar to what we use in Java. Or they have so-called generics. We have them in Java, they have them in TypeScript. So they use async await already in the language. So they play by the rules, meaning that they look in the TC39 standards, what's going on with the ECMAScript language, and they implement it sooner, or they expand it. But the fact that you write in the TypeScript means that you need to transpile it or compile it into JavaScript, because browsers don't support TypeScript and they are not planning to. So you add an extra step of compilation, and TypeScript comes with compiler. Also, TypeScript has excellent IDE support, so they have a special language service, and with a bunch of plugins that work the same in any IDE. So it helps you a lot in development. It makes development much more productive. Why
did Angular choose TypeScript rather than just going for straight JavaScript?
Again, productivity. Productivity matters. I can tell experience from our company. Many years ago, we used to use, actually we still use it, but we started many years ago a project using a super popular back then framework called Adobe Flex. I don't know if you remember that. Mm-hmm. It was excellent framework, excellent web development framework, but it requires Flash Player as a runtime, which is out of fashion for many years, as everybody knows. We had a ton of code written in Flex framework. And we started to look into JavaScript world. How do we move pieces of Flex code into JavaScript? And we have excellent developers, senior developers. We started to give them, take this piece and rewrite it in JavaScript. And we noticed immediate drop in productivity. When people started to write in JavaScript, again, they are smart guys, that whatever you could do in Flex in 1 day, in JavaScript you would need to do in 4 or 5 days. And in TypeScript, we see that it's much closer to what we saw before in strong or strict languages.
So you're saying that you prefer TypeScript because it's more productive and
more predictable,
okay.
And tooling is a lot better than with JavaScript.
You spoke earlier on about testing, about using the spec.js. How do we do automated testing with Angular?
Well, Angular comes with a couple of frameworks already. Remember I told you in the beginning you use Angular CLI, it generates your project, which includes support for unit testing and for end-to-end testing. Angular automatically installs for you the project that is installed with Jasmine framework, which is super popular in JavaScript world. So that's the framework for unit testing that is supported by default by Angular. Angular has some API on top of it, but by default they support Jasmine, and they also support Mocha framework for unit testing. For end-to-end testing, or sometimes some people call it functional testing, when the entire application is emulated like as if users are clicking through the buttons and going through the menus. For that, it comes with Protractor framework, also open source, but it's from Google. So the frameworks are there. And also, the newly generated project comes with pre-configured Karma test runner. So you can run the test from the command line. Karma is, again, very popular. It was a whole bunch of plugins for different browsers. So since you can run tests using Karma command line, command, you can implement it in your build process. So when you run builds or deployments, you put in the script this one extra line, karma, and which will start your tests. So this is how you automate testings.
And what can we test?
You can test any piece of functionality. For example, in unit tests, you can test a function, you can test a class, but specifically for Angular, there are certain members of the framework that require testing, such as router.
Okay.
We want to test a router. What if I want to go to place A to place B? Router actively uses this location or address bar of the browser. So it tries to match whatever you see in the location to whatever was configured as a route in the code. So it checks that it works nicely. Now, when you create a component in Angular framework, and the component gets data from somewhere and populates the variable, and it shows on the UI using binding. And all this happens magically. How can you test that? Now you want to write a test that will manually create an instance of a component, and manually want to do something that will force the UI to change. So that the API is over there. Or you want to write a unit test for services. Service makes a request to the server side using HTTP, for example. But in unit test must be fast. We don't want our test to fail just because somebody else's server is down. So there are mocks for all these HTTP requests, so we can create mocks and make sure our test works. So these are specific things for Angular.
Can you simulate events, such as the user clicking on a button or the user moving the mouse?
Of course. You can emulate any event, that's correct. Moreover, we never touched one thing, which is the change detection. How Angular knows that UI has to be updated, refreshed, that some value changed and it needs to be pushed to the UI. This is an area of major improvement comparing to AngularJS. In AngularJS, a developer was responsible for saying, oh, I believe that now is the right moment to update the UI. In Angular, they use a special library called Zone.js that is monitoring any asynchronous calls that can be originated from your app, and they group them together and understand that, oh, you made 2-3 asynchronous calls. Did they come back? For example, you click on the button, you call set timeout, you made a HTTP request 1 or 2. So this Zone.js understands that you created a bunch of asynchronous calls and now they came back, and now it automatically will push the changes to the UI. So when you write tests, unit tests, you can force this change detection from your test to see how things will work in the real world.
Can we test that correct HTML is produced?
Yes, you can. When I mentioned that you can test components, you would be manually creating an instance of new class which represents a component, but component is a class plus a template. So you will create manually an instance of the component. You will get a reference to this object in memory that you instantiated. But also, you will get a reference to the DOM element that Angular would create for you, because component needs to be represented eventually as a DOM element. So you would create an instance of this component in a special way, get 2 references. One to the instance of the class in memory, and the other to the instance of the DOM element. Then on the class, you will set the variable, say, customer name to Mary, and then you initiate change detection, and then you will write a test checking, do I have an H1 element with the values inner HTML as Mary? So you can definitely test that. You assign the variable in the class, in the object, and then you see the same value in the DOM, so you can test it.
Okay, just quickly, what is the DOM?
Document object model, right? So it's basically when you look at the page in the browser, behind the page there is like a tree of elements. So if you have a page with a button and an anchor tag, a link, behind the scenes you will have a tree of objects that represent your page. So anytime the browser renders a page, behind it there is a DOM tree or DOM object.
Okay, I'd like to move on to performance now. What are the major performance issues in a JavaScript or a web application?
In AngularJS, in older version of Angular, there were performance problems in rendering, and in many occasions these problems were caused by two-way bindings that is used under the hood magically everywhere. And now change detection mechanism, it does one single path through the component tree. For example, you made a change on the UI in a grandchild component. This change detection mechanism will traverse your tree of components from top to bottom only one time. There is no circle dependency, nothing, comparing to what was there before. So in that regard, UI is much faster. Second, there are easy ways to modularize an application. Your application can have a landing page which is very light, and it will be rendered pretty fast. And this would give the user feeling, actually it's a perceived performance, right? So maybe it's not actual performance improvement, but the user will be very happy because, boom, the landing page is right there. And in the background, other modules will be loaded. So when the user will click on the button, the module will be loaded on demand, or it could be preloaded. The other thing is when the bundles are created, there is a process called tree shaking under the hood. Webpack comes with it, and it removes all code that is not used. So a small application, the size of a small application is that you deploy is like around 100 kilobytes, which is rather small. I mean, this includes the framework.
Okay.
Your code is of small app plus the framework. And
you mentioned earlier on server-side page rendering. Could you explain what that is and how Angular does it?
And basically, there was an effort which started as a community effort to create something called Angular Universal. The idea was to pre-render the page to pre-create it on the server. So, first of all, downloading of the page would be faster if it's ready. And second, it would be much more friendlier in terms of search engine optimization. So this was an effort that was community-driven. And now Angular decided to include it as a part of framework. I'm not exactly sure about the scheduling, but I believe it's already a part of Angular. So if you want, you can use Angular Universal to pre-render pages on the server side.
Okay. And just quickly moving on to security, what are the main issues in browser security, and what are the types of exploits that can be carried out if you don't think about security when you're developing your application?
Angular doesn't introduce any new threats or any additional provisions in terms of security, not that I know of. Actually, no. There is a so-called sanitizer, which they prevent from, when you are rendering images, they prevent from entering malicious code. Other than that, Angular is as secure or as insecure as any other web application. So there is nothing additional that is introduced by Angular. In Angular, typically what you would do, you would create a service for authorization, authentication, you would invoke it, and based on that, you can arrange navigation. Moreover, we can allow you to click on this link if you are a manager or admin, and not click on the link if you are not admin. Also, when we work in dev mode, Angular comes with a dev server. Actually, under the hood is a Webpack dev server. So the way you work is you run the build in a special mode, so it's built in memory. And you keep working, you could keep making changes in the code, and it's sort of immediately re-rendered on the page. And you run it on certain port, for example, 4200. On the other hand, you may have a server written in some other technology running in port 8080. That server is the REST server that would feed you data. So we have a situation, how do you deal with the same origin problem? So you want to use this local web server, you make request to the server on port 4200, but your application that loaded needs to make requests for data to the server that runs on 8080. So you kind of violate the same origin policy. So in Angular, they allow you to create so-called proxy file, and you can say that whenever you see in the API, in the URL of the request, AJAX request, say /APIs, then redirect it to a server running on port 8080. It's also very easy to be done in Angular.
So let me see if I've got that. Angular doesn't necessarily, apart from the sanitization, like you say, it doesn't necessarily help you with authentication, or there's nothing built in to help you with authentication or any of the other exploits that you could have.
Actually, I said that it has a class for sanitization for the images, but other than that, I don't know about any specific provisions, right?
Okay. So imagine I have an existing complex application which is just using JavaScript. I want to move towards Angular for this application. Do I need to do it all at once, or can I do it piece by piece?
There is basically Angular is meant for creating of single page applications. So the best fit is to create an app and it loaded as a main application and then use it. But if you want to use it in pieces, you can still do this. You can create maybe a library using Angular. You can publish it as a package, as a module, as an Angular module. It will be compiled into a module. And if you want to use it, if your main application supports working with modules, then you can load it. But to be honest with you, I wouldn't go this route. If I had an application written in JavaScript, I would probably go all the way around. I would create maybe a shell or a main page in Angular, and then I would bring gradually or in one shot the rest of the code.
Okay, right. So thank you for talking to us, Yakov. Is there anything else I should have asked you?
Probably you should have asked me if Angular is one of the best solutions on the market today or not. I would say that for the front-end development, Angular will have the same impact as, for example, a Spring framework had in the Java world. It is a large framework. It can be used in many areas. It is a good fit when you have an enterprise team with different skill level. It has with everything that you need. So when the new person comes into the project, if he knows Angular and work with somewhere else, so he pretty much can start working pretty fast. In many cases in community, they start these flame wars such as what is better, Angular or React, for example. In general, it's a wrong approach because Angular is a framework while React is a library. But I can just say that if you have, I already mentioned this in the beginning, if you have a group of one or more people with super skills, then you can go with library, but otherwise I would recommend using Angular.
How can listeners find out more about Angular?
The listeners can go to angular.io, and there's a link to the documentation. There's plenty of documentation on over there. There are plenty of books written on Angular.
Including yours?
Including ours. It's not me, it's me and my colleague. Then tons of blog. Also, I would recommend watching one particular conference, Google run conference twice a year called ngconf. Typically, there are lots of high quality presentation and talk over there, and they are literally next day available on YouTube. So I would recommend watching there. And Stack Overflow works pretty nicely. It's very active. As a matter of fact, I believe that it's about 1 million people today who are already using Angular with TypeScript. So the community is huge, and Stack Overflow will help you pretty fast.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, Yakov. Where can people find out more about you and your books?
Well, I have a blog, which is myname.com, yakovfain.com. I have Twitter, obviously, yfain. The same handle on the Stack Overflow, the same where else, on GitHub. And I'm pretty pleased and happy with the fact that we published code samples for the book on GitHub. And this project with code sample has almost 300 stars. To me, is the best appreciation. I think that we did a good job with that book. And we keep updating that GitHub site. So if you don't want to buy a book, for whatever reason, then go on GitHub and download many, many examples that we created.
We'll link to those in the show notes.
All right.
This is Matthew Farwell for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.